Hi, this is Bill Heinlein. I'm the field CTO of Chronosphere and excited to be here today to talk about building a great strategy your CFO will love. I'm also excited to be joined by Ben Hastings from Nationwide. And Ben, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself as well.
Hello, folks. Thanks for joining in today. I'm Ben Hastings. I've been in Southwest Ohio my whole life and spent a career revolved around research and practical application of performance and reliability engineering, with the last 10 plus years focused on front end and observability and trying to help teams do the right thing. So looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks, Bill. Turn back to you.
Great, thank you. So we're going to go through a number of items today from an agenda perspective. We'll start with talking about the importance of an observability strategy in general. We'll talk a little bit about what's changed in the observability space that makes a strategy even more important. We'll talk about some strategies for balancing cost with visibility and the outcomes. And we'll spend a good part of the time doing a good, just casual conversation between Ben and I, and we'll leave some time for Q&A. So we can move on to the next slide. So when we think about observability and the importance of an observability strategy, it's really about ensuring that an organization has a clear purpose for implementing observability and making sure that aligns to a business objective. Companies that have that alignment get better adoption, get better result in the end. And that strategy does a lot of things, among them things like establishing a framework for the metrics you'll collect, the traces and the logs you'll use, and clarifying what and how you'll measure. But what's changed, right? Why do the strategy, and what's changed in the environment? Well, there's a lot that has changed, honestly. The observability strategy that exists today is one that requires you to think about a lot of things. Our initial world was, smaller. If you want to advance to the next slide, please. We started out with more monolithic apps many years ago. With the advent of Kubernetes and cloud, things have changed. We have containerized things, and the volume of data, if we go to the next slide, has changed dramatically. So what was once just a few containers is now millions of containers, and millions of microservices and billions of metrics. So that makes it even more important to have a strategy, and a strategy that helps you understand the volume of data that you need. And the volume of data has also dramatically increased. So thinking about what's important and why you'll collect what you'll collect and how you'll measure, and all of those things as we talk through a strategy, are important so that you don't drive costs up unexpected. So we'll continue on. We can continue with the next slide. So data growth can impact a variety of things, certainly cost, but it can also affect productivity. When we look at some of the stats here, 87% of the cloud native architectures have an increased complexity, and that troubleshooting is even more difficult than ever before. Having the right data makes sure you can solve these problems much faster, right? And it avoids also putting too much data out there, again, back to thinking about your strategy, that might drive false alarms or drive people down maybe a rabbit hole that has nothing to do with the issue at hand. When we think about the productivity, on average, 10 hours of a week is spent triaging and understanding incidents. So getting data there to make sure that you get the right insights in the time it matters the most is really important to help keep that amount of time of triage down. And there's a people problem here too, because there's a toll that incidents and all of this work takes on people, and it negatively impacts their careers. People don't want to spend time on incident calls. They want to be innovative. They want to work on new things. They want to do exciting things. The reality is we still have to maintain what's in production. But when that becomes such a problem that it has a negative impact on your career and your mental health and your happiness, that becomes a problem. So data can actually help minimize that as well. Next slide. Valuable data. I mean, when we talk about the value of data, it means different things to different people. But at the end of the day, when you think about it from an observability perspective, valuable data is the data that a developer actively uses in their everyday work, in their troubleshooting of an incident, in their looking at code as they're developing to drive better performance, all those things. And so getting that data fine-tuned is really important. So let's talk a bit about strategies for balancing cost and visibility and making sure you get the best outcome possible. So we're going to have now a fireside chat, and it'll be a little less death by PowerPoint. That's never one of my favorite methods of presenting. And so Ben and I are just going to have a chat about a few things. Why governance is critical in a cloud native architecture. We'll talk about how to prioritize data based on the importance of that data and the importance of properly scoping data. And we're just going to have some brief discussion about each of these topics. So let's start. Pardon me, I'm looking at my questions on the side here to talk through them. So let's talk a little bit about observability and the data. You know, Gartner has said that observability is one of the hottest strategies in business today. And it also says that 70% of the companies that embrace observability are solving problems faster and better based on data-driven decisions. So, you know, cost is a significant barrier to people as they do observability. And there are companies, and I see it as I talk to customers, that subscribe to a school of thought of collect everything. So Ben, I guess I'd look to you and get your perspective on this. What's your experience been when it comes to your current and previous teams on collecting observability data?
That's a really good place to start, Bill. When we think about kind of the idea of observability, it's really about the easy part of the conversation is gravitating towards what data do we collect. But if we're collecting data, there needs to be a reason for it. It's all about, as you touched on earlier, quick detection of problems and then using that data to help navigate to an understanding of what interesting thing is happening. And I think it's really important to balance the tension of I have data that I know represents a success state or a failure state, with only focusing on that data to thinking a little more broadly. If we're honest with ourselves, we don't know all of the failure conditions of a system that we have. I mean, we generally talk about the unknown unknowns. If you're not capturing the right kind of data or not approaching the data that you have in the right way, you're going to come up with something novel and not be able to address it. So it's tricky there, but I think the real pitfall that I've seen is over-indexing in the wrong space. So making everything a log or depending too much on just synthetic testing. And when we've got these components in place, it kind of lulls the business into a false sense of security. Well, I've got all the logs, so I can quickly identify and triage. That's kind of where some of the teams have gravitated. But ultimately, we've got to focus on making sure that the data that we're getting is telling a useful story, and we can do something useful with it. So, there's certainly some good questions for framing that, but I think it really comes down to that balance between making sure I've got the right kind of data properly scoped so that I can answer the questions that I have now and that I may have in the future. What about you, Bill?
I think for me, it's been encouraging teams to start simple. That you always are going to want to build on a foundation of metrics that you started with, and that need will grow over time as you learn about maybe hotspots in your environment and that sort of thing. But I think people sometimes get out over their skis and try to capture everything all the time in hopes that they're going to reach that holy grail of predictability. And I think more often than not, just starting with even the very basics of metrics that give you the load, response time, and error rate of your environment is a great way to start. And then adding on, right? Maybe some specifics about your Kafka environment, maybe the number of Kafka replicas is important to you because you know it's been a problem before, or it's a critical piece. But you add those because you know about them, you have a specific reason to. You don't just go, as I like to say, shop for metrics, because that's what gets, I think, teams into trouble. I see teams look at metrics that they don't understand. Those metrics cause an alert to fire. You stand up an incident, and it winds up being a false alarm. And that, honestly, I think false alarms, I say this a lot, are a bit of a death march to the credibility of your observability installation in your platform. If people get woken up too many times, or have to context switch too many times due to false alarms, they stop paying attention. So
Absolutely.
when I think about my experience as a practitioner and getting the DevOps teams there with picking meaningful metrics, I like to start out with keeping it simple. Like I said, that load, response time, and error rate. But I also think about it from a business perspective. And I go back to the very fundamental, get out of the technical for a sec and ask, why did this app get developed in the first place? Like, if you think back to the very first business justification for why you built the app, why does it exist? And what are the 5, 10 reasons that it exists, and what are those features expected to do? And then talk about building SLOs and SLIs around those to really think about giving yourself some scope around what you want to measure. I think it's just a good tool I've seen. What, Ben, have you used to help give teams like maybe a starting point for scoping the data?
Yeah, getting folks to kind of reset perspective is always a challenge, especially if there's a particular behavior that's been long entrenched. But really, I focus on two areas. One parallel to what you're talking about. Usually we talk about red metrics, rate, error, duration, and that seems to resonate pretty well with most of the developers that I work with. And always, there's always that tension between delivering functionality versus non-functional requirements. And if you start with an out-of-the-box implementation, pretty much any of the technologies that you're using to measure, but especially looking at metrics with a Prometheus implementation, or even some of the level up approaches using open telemetry, it's pretty straightforward to derive those red metrics out of the box. And I always tell teams to take a look at that data. Just let the auto instrumentation run and see what you get for a while. You're going to be surprised, hopefully delighted with what you see, rather than terrified. There are some cases where that happens, but if you focus on that approach, then go in and fill in the blanks as needed. Add some extra instrumentation around this function, or if you've got a unique database or platform that doesn't get the requests don't get captured automatically, go in and add that in. But bigger picture, to get the development teams and the business on board, there's an over-indexing again on easy measurement, making sure you've got your entire network stack captured, or every CPU metric in the world represented and brought together. And those are interesting metrics, and we want to understand them. But in reality, if you've architected well, you can have one or more nodes go out to lunch and your customer experience is never impacted. So I like to talk about front door experiences. If we
Mhm.
focus on, I think you were saying those like 4 or 5 things that the app is made to do. Um, that works especially for APIs, but I like to take it up even higher. What is that front door? What is your top level URL that someone comes to interact with? Is it chronosphere.com? Is it nationwide.com? What does that look like? If the customer can't get to it, if they can't log in, if they can't interact, then it doesn't matter what feature you have behind that first step. If they can't experience it, then they're not going to see the cool things that you've developed. So if we focus on those front door experiences and then start to look at what support those, then we'll find, maybe there's some gaps in what we need to measure. But looking at it from that outside in perspective seems to be a really good way to help frame some of that conversation, thinking about how to scope data, how to govern data as we're trying to collect to understand what's going on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, customer experience is the reason that, or customer experience and things like, revenue generation and conversion rates and all that are the reason a lot of these apps exist. And if you don't have it, then observability is there to help you get it. But it's important to keep that in mind and keep that in perspective as you put observability, and to remember, why am I doing this in the first place, and why does the app exist? And I think that helps frame the scope. I also, to quote a piece from the Google SRE book, um, and I'm not going to quote it verbatim, but it basically says reliability is the most important feature. Right.
Absolutely.
And I think that it's easy to lose sight of that when you get into the shopping for metrics routine on, maybe I should do this one and that one and the other, and maybe they're good, but you can get lost in a sea of manuals and metrics opportunities if you're not careful. So good.
You need to look no further than a toddler interacting with, looking for the Bluey to show up on TV, and there being some network interruption or some service outage,
Yeah.
and they melt down. We maybe don't melt down quite as expressively as they do when the services we're interacting with don't behave the way we expect them to, but we're absolutely disappointed when we go to do the thing and it's not available. So
Well, and that's an incredibly powerful point, because in this day and age, and I'm just as guilty as anybody, an app that just, it's continuously unreliable or slow or crashes is an app that gets deleted pretty quickly from my phone, and that can mean that somebody loses some business. So I think it's great. um
absolutely.
let's move on to the next section here, our next question here, and let's talk about observability strategy in general. I think that a lot of technologies, AI, I think, is a great example, but observability is certainly an example of this. They become buzzwords, people hear about them, and they get caught up in, we need to do this because people are doing this. But I think with observability in particular, and going back to what we were just saying about remembering why the app exists, I think you've got to do the same thing with observability. Getting people to buy into observability and the work that is required, especially if you're going a bit greenfield, is tough. I think it's very similar to where many companies were with cyber preparedness and making sure
Mhm.
that holes are plugged and things like that years ago, right? It's work that we all had to go back and sort of refactor and put in, but the importance of it outweighs the hassle in the long run. But I think getting people to understand that observability underpins your business strategy and making that connection before you start picking tools and telling people you're going to do observability, it needs to be one of the first parts of your message. We're doing observability because it aligns with this goal in our organization, and not a technical goal, necessarily, but all the way up to a business goal and trickles down. So what's your experience been?
Well, so in previous roles, I worked for a publisher and I Elsevier, one of the largest publishers of peer-reviewed journal content. So, if there's someone working on a PhD and they have an article they produce, Elsevier is one of the publishers. Only one group publishes an article. So if you want that article content, you have to go to Elsevier to get that one article. Um, and in my time at Fidelity, many of us have 401ks or experience there. The people that have 401ks with Fidelity aren't the ones choosing to use Fidelity for their 401k. That's somebody else making that choice.
Mhm.
Both of those scenarios, your business metrics may look good because you're getting article views or people are engaging with their retirement funds and so on. But at the end of the day, they don't have a choice but to go to those things. So this goes back to what we were talking about. The best functionality in the world doesn't matter if it's not available and if it's not fast. Um, so having that frame of mind is really useful. But I think one of the biggest values that observability provides, not just for lighting up those experiences, making that visible, um, but really that whole site reliability engineering concept. I think service level objectives have been one of the best opportunities for bringing together technical teams and business teams to talk about things in the same way. I tend to lean on the red metrics because of the computed availability SLO. When we get business folks thinking about, okay, well, so many people requested our thing, and we responded with this many errors or this many slow events, it's easy for business folks to think about those interactions in those terms. And it's very obvious for the technical teams to think about it that way. So for me, one of the biggest opportunities is getting folks on the same page from a terminology perspective, how we're thinking about these things. And in all of my previous roles and working with others in the industry, it's very clear when we see availability, reliability, and performance improve, we see engagement and customer satisfaction improve. So bringing those things together is super valuable, and really helps accelerate that culture of engagement for uh, bringing together the business side and the technology teams to make sure that those customer experiences are as good as they can be.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think and having all of that thought through and built into your strategy in the beginning as you're building out a plan to deploy observability or even to deploy a new observability platform is really important to getting people to jump on the bandwagon with you because they understand the why, which I think is something that we often leave out in the business world as we're trying to get things done in our environment, getting people to understand why it's important to them and actually what's in it for them and why it actually long term it might mean they get to sleep more, which is something that's pretty exciting for most people.
Absolutely.
One thing I want to touch on briefly is the governance that's important in cloud native and just get your quick, so this is sort of an ad hoc, but the importance of governance and things like tagging and the importance of things like um, making observability a first class citizen and having enablement in place to help teams really be successful, because to the point of getting people to jump on the observability bandwagon, they have to feel enabled, they have to be given the tools and the resources to do it, but there needs to be some guideposts set up along the way, and things like tagging, for example. But what are just quickly, what are some of the things that you've found have been really important to think about and set aside as part of your strategy so that people do feel that enablement?
So, ultimately, in any investment that we make, we boil it down to return on investment. Are we getting more out of it than we put into it? And when we think about spend in the observability space, the same calculus is required. Now, we may not always talk about it in those terms, but regardless of whether we're talking about a large team that is responsible for running a bunch of open source, kind of built into Kubernetes, some of the default capabilities that are there, or whether we're talking about a large investment or medium, whatever investment with a vendor that provides a package solution, we need to make sure that we're getting the right value out. And when I talk about governance, if it's not in place, for me, it's really just a couple of questions. It's who's using our service, how
Mhm.
much are they using it, and how effectively are they using it? And to your point, without the right context, without the right metadata, we can't answer those questions
Mhm.
effectively. If we think about things like alerting rules, I mentioned the over-indexing on synthetics. If
Yep.
you've created a synthetic test, but you don't have the right tagging so that an alert triggers the appropriate action or the right team gets notified, what good is having the alert in place? Um, the more we flesh out our data, the more opportunities we have to connect the dots and to build the picture of what that distributed tracing map could or should look like. So when something goes bump in the night, that just accelerates the opportunity for identifying where to focus some energy. Or, as I mentioned a little bit ago, you may have some app and half a cluster is out to lunch. If the customer is not bothered by it, nobody needs to be woken up at night.
Right.
Someone needs to address it in the morning, but nobody should be woken up for something that isn't impacting our customers. So um, there's a lot to talk about in that metadata tagging space, but
For sure.
that's really where I start the conversation with folks when we're trying to take some right steps in the governance direction.
And I think those things are important too when you think about, as we've talked about scoping data, that's really um the focus of this conversation has really been making a prior or a strategy that your CFO will love. And the key to getting there is about the data you collect and the value of that data, and making sure you can somehow determine that value is really important. um, but also have just being thoughtful about what you pick. And going through all that thought also requires some governance, as you point out, so that tagging is there so that you can understand what's driving it. If a team decides to add a set of metrics in, as long as they're tagged, then it makes it a bit easier to understand where did that sudden increase in metrics and therefore cost come from, and is it driving the value you needed it to? So great points. I think we just have one more question, then we'll move on to um, maybe some Q&A here. Actually, a couple of more. First of all, you talked a little bit about, I think you mentioned something about, building, something in-house or versus buy. Build versus buy is something that, as we talk to customers, is often a big question around their strategy. Should they build versus buy? I have a rather um rigid a feeling towards it, and that will probably seem a little bit biased given my current world role. But I do wonder if folks think about the value of engineers and taking those engineers away from something that's innovative and making them money or driving their customer experience or all that, and in to sacrifice it to sacrificing that to give it to something like building an observability platform in-house. And I'm curious as what your advice would be for leaders who are really thinking about, okay, do I go and make this big SaaS investment or do I build it in-house? And what do you think are the pitfalls of those?
Sure. So this had to show up at some point. My degree study was mathematics, so I approach things through that lens. And when I hear a question like this, I think back to those, middle school algebra classes with story problems. And sometimes the answer isn't X equals some number. Sometimes the answer is too many variables with too many unknowns. So I don't think that there is one right answer for this. I grew up around technology. I'm probably one of the few people around my age that had a computer in my home from the time I can remember. Always decomposing, digging in. So I have a strong bias towards open source,
Mhm.
and really want to leverage that as much as possible. But it does, there again, there's a trade-off. How big is the team that you have? How big is the org? And how much time are they willing to invest? So definitely if it's a smaller company starting up, there's a whole lot of value in outsourcing the right kinds of capabilities. In a larger organization, at Fidelity, we had some tremendous open source capabilities, but we had um, a team of roughly 40 folks split between the US and India that were able to devote the time to scaling and managing and governing those platforms effectively. Um, there may have been some times where we could have spent our energy in a different direction, but that was a choice that we were willing to make. I, I think even going down that path, looking at uh, leveraging some of the open source capabilities out there. If you're going to go down that path and prototype something, I think you need to make sure that you have some clear success criteria and milestones in place so that you can say, well, for this much data, yeah, it makes sense. The how to works, single node out of the box, no big deal. But at some point, your business becomes more successful and you go from one Kubernetes cluster or pod to, the picture that we showed earlier of hundreds,
Yep.
thousands.
Yep.
And there's somewhere between that one or two and tens, hundreds, and so on, where managing the scalability and managing the cost of that scalability outpaces the size of your team or the budget that you might have. And that ROI might start very positive because you're not putting out a whole lot. But as that utilization starts to grow, the variables start to shift. So I think going into it eyes wide open with a really clear definition of what success looks like is important. Um, but the further I get along in this journey and the more teams of various sizes, right now we've got a very small team managing observability at Nationwide. If it weren't for the vendors that we're making use of, there's no way we could be successful supporting the enterprise. So, um, but even at that, depending on what tool you're looking at, the ROI still may be negative. So you've got to be thoughtful about what success looks like for you and your organization. So that's my take on it. Be happy to hear what your approach is, biased though it may be.
Well, I mean, first of all, I love your math analogy, and who better to have in a conversation and a question like that than somebody who is a math person. Um, I I tend to look at something as observability as something that needs to become a utility, right? And therefore I tend to look at it as something that is important, but an operational need, and the need to move people away. And again, I think you're absolutely right. It depends on the size of the organization, but I think a small, scrappy organization in particular probably wants to devote their expensive engineering and development resources to something that's making them money
Yep.
or driving customers or whatever they're in the business to do, they're focused on that, on the more strategic things. And so observability can quickly become a pretty big overhead for an organization to manage when they build it on their own. So that's, I think, where I come from. Having led observability at a large enterprise, I also think that if you have the team, if you have the bandwidth in that team, then it's certainly a good way to get started, but you've got to have a path on, is that what you're going to commit to for the long term? So I
Yep.
generally swing towards not building and treating this as a utility and focusing on enablement of the organization. But I, what's good for me is not necessarily good for everyone. I certainly understand that.
Uh, I'll just add, I like that utility, and I'm thinking like electric, plumb,
Yeah.
water, gas service utility. That yeah, I think that's a really useful way of looking at it, um, regardless of the size of I'm thinking from a scaling perspective. If you've
Mhm.
got you know, if you're building a barn in the middle of nowhere, you don't need a whole lot of work for that. But if you've got a high rise um, in New York City, even if you outsource the supply, there's still a team required to ensure governance is in place and things like that. But you want to make sure that they're focused on our teams using it well rather
Right.
than keeping the service up and running. So I don't think we're quite so far there. I love getting my hands on
Yeah.
code when I can. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I
No, I
lean
agree
that
with
way.
you.
Yeah.
So that's a great segue into our last discussion point here around a culture of observability. I talk about a culture of observability and building that as I talk to customers all the time, and it's really about that buy-in, but getting people not to just agree with observability, but they do use it like utility. They rely on it as a utility, and it's not just the development team. It's not just an ops team. It's not just that SRE. It's kind of everybody within technology. And for an organization with a really mature environment, then you likely are talking to people in the business, like your digital marketing teams and things like that, who care about a lot of metrics that can come from observability. I think that's, if you have that strong culture, that means observability is a first-class citizen. Your developers are putting instrumentation in, or have auto instrumentation set up. So that happens in sprint one, and they're taking advantage of observability in sprint as they're developing to make their code better and maybe take more risk than they otherwise would have, and test less, frankly, maybe for some less critical pieces, and allow observability to be the safety net. But there's all sorts of ways, all of this driving an observability culture um, are advantageous. But I think at the end, as we tie it into making the CFO happy, the more it's used, the more it's adopted, the more you have this culture of it's just there, it's expected, it's a utility, the more you're going to get a better ROI and more benefit from it. So what are some of the things from your perspective that have helped drive an observability culture for you?
Yeah. So I touched on this a little bit ago, but I think making sure that all the stakeholders are coming to the table and talking about things in the same way is so critical. I've probably heard 12 different definitions of what an SLO is or should be. Um, and I'm sure that there are others that are used that no one was willing to speak up. So it's really challenging when you've got different stakeholders with different roles in the org, um, business, project management, operations engineers, developers, all talking about SLOs, for instance, but each of them has a different picture of what that means in their mind. That's counterproductive,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, so, uh, man, if we can start simple, that's where we want to get folks to come together. So, some of the things we've hit on, like thinking about the customer experience first. Let's get everybody to agree that the front door is the most important thing to have shiny and clean and the porch lights on. It looks good. We want to make sure we've got that right.
Good
And then
curb
we
appeal.
want to make, pardon?
Good curb appeal.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Um, but with that, we want to make sure that everybody's agreeing on how we measure that. Um,
Mhm.
you know, um, Even just the term performance, depending on if you're talking to the performance testing organization or the marketing team, they both talk about performance, but they mean different things. The performance engineering team means how fast, the marketing team means how many conversions, so getting folks to think about the customer experience and how to measure that, and talk about that in consistent ways is super important. Um, and kind of building on that a little bit, um, observability does depend on the data, but it's not just melt. It's making sure that I understand if that experience is positive or not. And when, I use the archery analogy a lot, that you've got an SLO and it's this target, and every arrow is a customer interaction. The ones that hit are good, the ones that miss are not. So, when we say an SLO is 95% or whatever, that means that you're saying that it's okay for 5% of your interactions and whatever time interval, it's okay for those to fail. And when we get folks, and that's not wrong at all.
Right.
But we need to have that agreed to framing in mind. Um, and I think part of that comes back to, again, being truly data driven. So instrument your code, instrument your app, and see what it says. Don't say that I need my APIs to respond in 100 milliseconds, and that's the goal that that's the hill I'm going to die on. And then you start to instrument it, and you're lucky if your average is 500, let alone your P95.
Right.
Um, so getting folks to talk about things in consistent ways, thinking about measuring in consistent ways that everybody agrees to, and then setting realistic goals based on observations. Absolutely, if 100's where you want to be and it's technically possible to get there, you know, set your goal where it is and aim to get there. Absolutely invest in that, but don't set yourself up for failure by arbitrarily drawing a line in the sand. So that goes back to that alert fatigue that you were talking
Yeah,
about earlier.
that's great
What about
advice.
you? Yeah.
I think that you make some very good points, which I agree with. And it really goes back to um, just a great strategy in communicating that. And a big part of an observability strategy, just like any other strategy, is organizational change management. And part of that organizational change management means you're building a framework of a strategy and then getting feedback from key stakeholders. And you understand who your detractors might be, and you understand who your champions are, and how do you get your detractor to a champion in as many cases as possible. And the way you do that is to get people to an understanding. People are detractors because they don't understand what's going on, how it affects them, or they don't agree with something and they haven't, in some cases they don't agree and they've given their feedback and they didn't win, and that you're always going to have that. But in many cases, it can be people who don't understand things like what observability can do for them, or they don't understand that, hey, we're talking about SLOs and you don't have to have 100%, you know, or, a 3 millisecond response time. It's something that there's a framework built and you agree on it as a service owner, that sort of thing. So I think those are all really important things. As we have about 10 or about 12 minutes left, I think we've got some questions in the chat that I was going to read. One of them around that organizational buy-in on a strategy. And I think we've talked a lot about that. I think back to organizational change management, the last thing I'll say about that is a comms plan and having a communications plan that gets all of this detail out there and gives it's like a call for comment and that sort of thing out there, so people feel engaged in it. Is really important, because you don't want to roll all of this out and it be a surprise to people and then give them a date when it's going to start. You will immediately start out with detractors. Have you had similar experience?
Oh yeah. Communication is absolutely critical. Whether you're dialing up or levying a new requirement for folks, or maybe you've already got some practices that you've been involved with, or maybe a more traditional vendor that has done some observability washing, and you're moving to a more modern platform. Um, Communication is where it's at. If folks don't know what's coming, and I think you touched on this earlier, Bill, you've got to start with why. Why are we making the shift? Why are we making the change? How is this going to make my life better as a business owner, a product manager, a DevOps team member that's responsible for the health of this tool or this application? If you can't make that messaging clear, um, you're you're going to have a lot more challenges than you need.
Great. We've got a couple more questions I'll go to here in the chat. One of them is around custom metrics. It says custom metrics are very expensive. What techniques or advice do you have on how to make dev teams aware of how their decisions on what they're collecting is impacting cost? I'll let you go
So
first.
yeah, sure. I thought that might be the case with the pause. So again, this is where bringing it back to the idea of a strategy your CFO will love. Governance is absolutely critical. Just spinning up a tool and letting folks have at it is not a good way to be successful. Um, if you've got the right attribution in place and can say that this category of metrics come from this app or this team, then
Yeah.
it makes it a lot easier. I said who's using it, how much, how effectively. And the fourth one is how much is it costing?
Mhm.
There may be a direct charge back, there may not. Even if there isn't a direct charge back, we need a way to represent that you're everybody else is doing this, you're doing this,
Mhm.
and you're costing the company more money. Maybe there's a justification for it, but um, when I think about custom instrumentation, a couple of things come to mind. One is it is extra code. You want to make sure that you're not tightly coupling um, with a library that isn't open and going to be consistent. But I can't remember where I heard this first, but every line of code is technical debt. I think that's a really good rule to live by. So the
Yep.
there are going to be cases where custom instrumentation is absolutely necessary, but that doesn't mean you start with instrumenting every single line of every method of every application that
Right.
you have out the door.
Right. No, I think that's great. So, um, one last question here, I think, is all we have time for. Let's see here. You mentioned getting the right value, Ben, when you were talking. You mentioned getting the right value. How do you enforce and ensure that the right metadata is available to measure? I think probably if we talked about how do you enforce something like tagging or some of the other things? I mean, we've talked quite a bit about attribution and that sort of thing. So maybe love to hear your take on that.
Yeah. So across the various roles that I've had, there has been a spectrum of maturity regarding automation, specifically in CI/CD practices. Um, in one of the organizations I've been part of, very, very mature. Code never saw the light of day in production unless it went through a CI pipeline and leveraged automation to deploy. And one of the things that we did was add a gate in that CI process that looked for a configuration file that set up the rules to decorate everything, regardless of log, metric, trace, event. Um, and again, thinking about communication, we didn't want to throw a new gate in and start throwing red flags when people didn't do the right thing. You communicate that that's going to take place. Then
Yeah.
we start with a yellow flag. Well, we're going to let you through, but we're going to keep spamming you every time you push new code and you leave this out for a couple of weeks. And by the way, after this date, it's not going to be a spam message that you can keep doing this. You're going to get shut off and not make it past that. So, um, for teams that have that kind of workflow in place, that's a positive route to pursue. Another team organization I've been part of was not mature from a CI CD perspective,
Mhm.
and we shifted the focus to the ingestion destination. So instead of um, fixing it at the source, um, we're looking at doing the same kind of practice, like identifying, flagging that data is being ingested that doesn't have the appropriate tagging. My gut reaction is drop it all at the front door. Don't let it in at all. Because if it's not appropriately tagged or attributed, what alert value are you going to get out of it?
Right. Right.
You know, I, I
Absolutely
mean,
true.
ostensibly somebody's using it, but who knows?
Yeah.
Um, but where possible, we want to do some proactive notification if we can find a way to get back to those folks and be like, hey, you need to fix this, then that would be the better outcome. Um, One of the things we're pursuing now is a shift from vendor specific agents to um, a telemetry pipeline approach
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
will allow us to, even if it's been missed, with that pipeline looking closer to the origin, there's some decoration, some metadata that can be supplied, you know, in the flow. So, there those are kind of three options, I guess, but um, ultimately it comes back to that culture discussion. Like
Yeah.
these are small investments that a team can make that open the door for tremendous value in using the data and connecting the data for this app or API to upstream and downstream dependencies. So getting that messaging right is really where it's at. But you know, fix it at the source, stop it at the destination, or try something with the pipeline in the middle. Those are really the three areas where we've had some success.
Great. I love, first of all, the use of the word decoration when you talk about attribution and tagging and that sort of thing. But I also loved your point about, if you have to do these things, you probably should look back at a greater problem, which is likely some governance challenges. You're not
Yep.
like, if you have to enforce something, with rules and spamming and that sort of thing as a regular practice, then you probably have some OCM work, some organizational change management work to do, communication to do, to get the message out on the importance of this as it comes to observability and making it valuable for everybody. So, well, listen, Ben, it has been a great opportunity to talk with you, and I appreciate your insights. I know our listeners do too, and really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us. For those
It's
of you
been
on the call, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time to spend with us.
Yeah,
So
thanks for the invite, Bill. It's been a good chat, and look forward to learning more about the good things you guys have going on.
All right.
awesome. Look forward to sharing that with you. Thank you.